Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the river beside your camp is smaller than it was yesterday. That isn't necessarily alarming. Rivers rise and fall, seasons change, and people who live closely with the landscape learn to expect variation. But the rain doesn't come. Days become weeks. The river continues to shrink. And the shallow pools where animals once gathered begin turning into patches of cracked mud. Plants that normally remain green start drying out, while familiar streams become weaker or disappear completely. Now the problem is no longer uncomfortable heat. It is survival. Today, a drought can affect millions of people. But modern societies have reservoirs, wells, pipelines, weather forecasts, and transportation networks capable of moving water across enormous distances. Tens of thousands of years ago, none of those systems existed. For prehistoric hunter-gatherers, water was something that had to be found within the landscape. If a reliable source disappeared, there was no emergency truck arriving tomorrow and no supermarket shelf filled with bottled water. Every person in the group still needed to drink. Children needed water. Adults needed water. And nursing mothers faced particularly demanding physiological needs. Water also mattered indirectly because the plants and animals humans depended upon were suffering from the same drought. This made prolonged drought much more than a problem of thirst. A landscape that stopped receiving enough rainfall could begin changing the entire survival system around a human group. Vegetation might become less productive. Animals could alter their movements. Wetlands could contract, and familiar gathering areas might stop providing the foods people expected to find there. The longer those conditions lasted, the more dangerous the situation became. Yet prehistoric humans survived repeated episodes of major climatic instability. Our ancestors and close human relatives lived through shifting rainfall patterns, expanding and contracting dry regions, changing lakes and rivers, and environmental transformations that unfolded across generations. That doesn't mean every population survived every drought. Some groups may have moved away, others may have become smaller, joined neighboring populations, or disappeared from particular regions entirely. In severe circumstances, drought could contribute to food shortages, competition, and mortality. But humans possessed one extraordinary advantage. They could respond before the landscape became completely unlivable. A prehistoric group did not need a weather satellite to notice that something was changing. People who depended directly on plants, animals, and water sources had powerful reasons to observe seasonal patterns closely. They could notice when expected rains arrived late, when certain plants failed to appear, when animals abandoned familiar routes, or when a waterhole was shrinking faster than usual. Those observations could become knowledge, and knowledge could be remembered. An older member of a group might know that another spring existed beyond a ridge, that a distant valley retained water during dry periods, or that a particular route led toward a more reliable river. This kind of ecological knowledge would have been enormously valuable. But we have to be careful about how we reconstruct it. Archaeology rarely preserves a conversation in which one prehistoric person tells another where to find water. Instead, researchers reconstruct ancient environments using evidence such as sediments, pollen, lake deposits, animal remains, and other environmental records. Archaeological sites can then show where human populations were present as those landscapes changed. These clues reveal that prehistoric humans repeatedly lived through environments that were anything but stable. So the real question is not whether ancient humans experienced drought. They certainly encountered periods when water became less predictable or less abundant in many regions and times. The more interesting question is what happened next. When a familiar river began disappearing, did humans simply remain beside it and hope for rain? Probably not. Humans could walk, explore, remember, and communicate. A drying landscape was dangerous, but it was also filled with information for anyone who knew how to read it. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to Sketching Humanity. Now imagine that the last pool near your camp is getting shallower every day. You don't know when the rain will return, and waiting until the water is completely gone could be fatal. Your first survival tool isn't a container, a well, or a map. It's knowing where water might still be hiding. Finding water in a drought begins with understanding that a landscape can look dry Without being completely without water, rivers and lakes are obvious sources. But water also moves beneath the ground, collects in particular terrain, and persists unevenly across an environment. For people who had lived within a region for years or generations, those patterns could become part of an accumulated mental map. A spring that looked insignificant during the rainy season might become critically important during drought. A deeper section of a river could retain water after shallower stretches had vanished, while certain valleys or low areas might remain wetter longer than exposed ground. Vegetation could also provide clues. Plants differ in their ability to tolerate dry conditions. An unusually green vegetation in an otherwise dry landscape can sometimes indicate access to moisture below the surface. Animals offered another source of information. Every terrestrial animal needs water in some form, although different species obtain it in different ways and drink with very different frequencies. Watching where animals moved could therefore provide clues about where resources remained available. Tracks converging toward the same area might be worth investigating. Birds and other animals could also reveal productive parts of a landscape, although there is no simple rule in which following any animal automatically leads a thirsty human to drinking water. Prehistoric survival was not a collection of magical wilderness tricks. It depended on detailed local knowledge. Knowing the landscape meant understanding which sources were permanent, which were seasonal, which could become dangerous, and how long it took to travel between them. That last point could determine whether a journey succeeded or ended disastrously. Humans lose water continuously through urine, breathing, and sweat during strenuous movement in hot conditions. Those losses can increase substantially. Searching randomly for water could therefore make dehydration worse. A successful strategy required more than knowing that water existed somewhere. People needed enough information to decide whether they could reach it. This is where memory became a survival technology. Imagine generations repeatedly traveling through the same broad territory. Children accompany adults. Routes are revisited. Camps are established near useful resources. And information about the landscape can pass from experienced individuals to younger members of the group. A distant water source that one person remembered could become knowledge available to many people. Social information dramatically changes the problem. One human searching alone can investigate only a limited area. A group can combine memories, recognize changes, and potentially send capable individuals to inspect known locations before moving everyone. We should not assume that every prehistoric society organized these decisions in exactly the same way. The social structures of deep prehistoric populations are often impossible to reconstruct in such detail. The larger principle, however, is important. Humans did not experience the environment only as individuals. They shared information. And when drought intensified, that shared knowledge could help transform an apparently empty landscape into a network of remembered possibilities. A spring beyond the hills, a river farther south, a wetland visited during another season, a place where animals still gathered. But eventually, even the best-known local sources could begin failing. At that point, ancient humans faced one of the most consequential decisions in prehistoric survival: stay or move. For mobile hunter-gatherers, leaving was not necessarily a sign of failure. Mobility was one of the most powerful ways humans could respond to changing resources. If water disappeared from one part of the landscape, people could shift toward another. This sounds obvious until we remember what moving actually required. A group might include children, older adults and people recovering from injuries. Tools, food, hides and other useful possessions had to be carried, while every additional kilometer required energy and water. Moving too early could mean abandoning resources that were still usable. Moving too late could mean beginning a difficult journey when people were already dehydrated and hungry. The decision therefore involved risk. Archaeological evidence cannot usually tell us the exact moment when one family looked at a shrinking water source and decided to leave. What archaeology can reveal are broader changes in where people lived and how settlement patterns responded to environmental conditions. Across human prehistory, changing climates repeatedly altered the geographic distribution of habitable environments. Wet phases could open corridors through regions that were otherwise extremely dry, while increasing aridity could restrict movement toward areas where water remained more dependable. Africa provides some of the most important examples because much of early human evolution occurred there. Regions that appear extremely dry today did not always look the same. Over long climatic cycles, rainfall patterns shifted, lakes expanded and contracted, and landscapes could alternate between greener and more arid conditions. The Sahara is perhaps the most dramatic reminder. At different times in the past, parts of what is now enormous desert contained lakes, rivers, grasslands, and abundant animal life. During wetter periods, humans could occupy landscapes that later became far more difficult to inhabit. When conditions shifted toward greater aridity, populations had to respond. Some could follow shrinking ecological zones toward rivers, lakes, highlands, coastlines, or other refuges where resources remained more reliable. This doesn't mean drought alone explains every prehistoric migration. Human movement has always been influenced by multiple factors, including food, population, social relationships, opportunities, and environmental change. But water places a hard limit on where humans can live. A territory can contain stone for tools, animals for hunting, and beautiful shelter locations. But if people cannot obtain enough water, those advantages become irrelevant. Mobility allowed humans to solve that problem by changing location rather than trying to force an increasingly dry environment to support them indefinitely. This flexibility may have been especially powerful because hunter-gatherers were not tied to permanent fields, large buildings, or infrastructure in the same way later agricultural communities could be. Their possessions still mattered, and landscapes could carry deep social meaning. But a mobile way of life made relocation physically possible. Sometimes the move might have been relatively short, perhaps shifting camp toward another part of a familiar territory. During larger environmental changes, movements could eventually contribute to population shifts across much greater distances. Over generations, climate and water availability helped reshape where humans could survive. Yet movement created another problem. The remaining water wasn't necessarily waiting in an empty landscape. Other humans needed it too. Moving toward a surviving water source could solve one problem, but it could create another. If your group knew where reliable water remained during a drought, there was a good chance that other humans knew about it too. This is one of the fundamental consequences of environmental stress. As usable water becomes concentrated into fewer places, people who were previously spread across a much larger landscape may begin moving toward the same rivers, springs, wetlands, or lakes. Animals would be doing something similar. A shrinking water source could therefore become an unusually crowded place. Herds might gather nearby, predators could patrol the same routes, and human groups that normally occupied different territories might suddenly find themselves much closer together. For prehistoric humans, that could create both opportunities and dangers. The obvious possibility is competition. Water is not an optional resource, and when there isn't enough for everyone, access to a dependable source can become extremely valuable. But we should resist imagining every drought automatically turning prehistoric humans into violent enemies fighting around the last puddle. Human relationships are more complicated than that. Groups could have relatives, exchange partners, or other social connections beyond their immediate camp. Those relationships could provide information about distant resources and potentially allow people to move through territories where they might otherwise have difficulty surviving. Cooperation could therefore become just as important as competition. Imagine two groups encountering one another near a surviving water source. They might compete over access, but they might also exchange information about animal movements, food availability, or conditions elsewhere. One group may know what lies beyond the next valley. Another may have recently traveled from a region where rainfall was better. Information itself becomes a resource. This is one reason human social networks can provide such a powerful buffer against environmental uncertainty. When resources fail locally, relationships with people living elsewhere can expand the number of options available. The archaeological record cannot tell us exactly how every prehistoric group negotiated access to water during drought, and we should not invent detailed rules that cannot be demonstrated. What we can recognize is the larger survival advantage of social flexibility. A group isolated within one small territory is vulnerable when that territory fails. A group connected to a wider network of people can potentially obtain information, assistance, and access to resources across a much larger area. Of course, those relationships would not eliminate conflict. Periods of resource scarcity can increase competition, and archaeological evidence from some prehistoric contexts demonstrates that violence certainly occurred among ancient humans. But connecting individual cases of violence directly to drought requires much stronger evidence than simply showing that both existed. Environmental stress does not produce one automatic human response. Sometimes people compete. Sometimes they cooperate. Sometimes they move away from one another. And sometimes difficult conditions encourage communities to strengthen relationships that help everyone survive. There was also another advantage to concentrating around reliable water. Animals needed it too. If drought changed where prey traveled, humans could adjust their own hunting strategies. A surviving river or lake might become not only a source of drinking water, but also a place where animals continued to gather. That could temporarily make some resources easier to predict. But drought was affecting those animals as well. Herds could decline, move farther away, or become physically stressed as vegetation disappeared. So even after humans found water, the survival crisis was not necessarily over, because you can survive thirst today and still face hunger tomorrow. A drought does not only remove water from the landscape, it reorganizes food. Plants respond to changing rainfall, and some species suffer more quickly than others. Fruits may become less abundant, edible leaves can disappear, seeds may be produced at different times, and underground plant foods can become harder to locate or less productive. Animals respond in turn. Herbivores depend on vegetation and available water, so their movements can shift dramatically during dry periods. Some species travel toward permanent water, while others rely more heavily on moisture obtained through food or use different strategies to tolerate dry conditions. Predators follow prey. Humans had to respond to the entire chain. This is where dietary flexibility became extraordinarily important. Humans are capable of eating a wide variety of foods. Depending on the region and period, prehistoric populations could exploit combinations of large and small animals, fish, shellfish, insects, fruits, seeds, nuts, tubers, and other plant resources. No single menu describes all prehistoric humans, and drought would not affect every food source in the same way. That diversity could become a survival advantage. If one familiar resource declined, people might increase their reliance on something else that remained available. A group that normally hunted particular animals might target different prey, while plant foods that were less desirable during good years could become valuable during scarcity. This does not mean ancient humans always had a convenient backup meal waiting nearby. Sometimes there simply wasn't enough food. But broad ecological knowledge gave people more possibilities than dependence on one resource alone. Water-rich foods could also contribute to hydration. Fruits, plant tissues, and animal foods contain varying amounts of water. Although obtaining moisture through food does not remove the basic human requirement for adequate hydration, the location of food mattered as much as its type. A productive patch that required a long journey through extreme heat might become too costly to exploit during drought. People had to balance the calories and water gained against the energy and hydration lost while reaching them. That makes drought survival an optimization problem, even though prehistoric humans would never have described it in those terms. Where should the group camp? How far can people safely travel? Which food sources remain worth pursuing? When should they abandon a familiar area? Every decision affected the next. A failed hunt during a wet season might be inconvenient. The same failure during prolonged drought, when alternative foods were already disappearing, could become much more serious. Food sharing could help buffer those risks. Hunter-gatherer food sharing systems vary enormously, so there is no universal prehistoric rule about who shared what with whom. Still, humans are capable of distributing resources within social groups, and sharing can reduce the danger created when individual foraging efforts fail unpredictably. Today you return with nothing. Someone else succeeds, and you eat. Tomorrow, the situation may be reversed. During severe scarcity, however, even sharing has a limit. A group cannot redistribute food that nobody can find. As drought continues, people may begin losing body mass and physical strength. Travel becomes harder, precisely when moving farther may be necessary, while hunting and gathering become more difficult as energy reserves decline. Children can be especially vulnerable to prolonged shortages, and reproductive demands can increase nutritional and hydration pressures on adults caring for infants. At this stage, the difference between a difficult dry season and a genuine survival crisis becomes increasingly narrow. The group needs more than clever food choices. It needs somewhere the drought has not completely conquered. Even during major droughts, landscapes rarely dry uniformly. Geography creates pockets where water and food can persist longer than they do in surrounding areas. These places can function as refuges. A refuge might be a permanent river, a lake supplied by distant rainfall, a spring fed by groundwater, a wetland, a coastline, or a higher elevation environment where local conditions remain more favorable. For prehistoric humans, reaching such a place could mean the difference between abandoning a region entirely and surviving until conditions improved. River systems are especially important because they can connect very different environments. A river may continue flowing through an arid region because its water originates far away, where rainfall conditions are completely different. The Nile provides a famous historical example of this principle. Although human relationships with African river systems extend far deeper into prehistory, lakes could also become crucial, but they were not necessarily permanent. Paleo-environmental records show that many ancient lakes expanded dramatically during wetter periods and contracted or disappeared as climates became drier. A shoreline that supported humans during one period could lie kilometers from the water during another. Coast offered a different set of possibilities. Marine environments could provide fish, shellfish, and other resources, while coastal landscapes sometimes offered ecological stability that differed from conditions farther inland. Researchers have therefore investigated the possibility that coastal resources served as important refuges for some prehistoric populations during periods of environmental stress. Again, there was no universal refuge that saved every group. The usefulness of a coastline, river or lake depended on geography, technology, available foods, population density, and the specific climatic event affecting the region. Highlands could sometimes provide another option because elevation influences temperature and rainfall. In certain environments, upland areas might retain moisture or vegetation when lower regions became much drier. But reaching a refuge had costs. If many humans and animals converged on the same remaining productive areas, those places could experience increasing pressure. Food might become depleted. Prey could be hunted more intensively, and competition between groups could increase. A refuge, therefore, did not make drought disappear. It bought time, and time was extremely valuable. Rainfall patterns can recover, animals can return, vegetation can regenerate, and populations can expand back into landscapes that had temporarily become difficult to inhabit. Humans did not need to defeat drought permanently. They needed to survive long enough for conditions to change, or move far enough to reach conditions that already had. This ability to shift between environments became one of the defining features of our species. But there is a dangerous temptation when telling stories about human adaptability. Because our species survived, it is easy to imagine that ancient humans always found a solution. They didn't. Sometimes the river disappeared, the animals left, the food failed, and the next reliable source was simply too far away. Prehistoric survival stories are often told backward. We know humans are alive today, so every ancient crisis can begin to feel like another challenge our ancestors were destined to overcome. But evolution does not work that way. The people experiencing a severe drought had no guarantee that their group would survive it. They did not know that humans would eventually spread across most of the planet, build cities, or invent systems capable of moving water across deserts. They only knew what was happening around them. And sometimes Every available option could be bad. Moving required water and energy. Staying required resources that were disappearing. Joining another population might not be possible. And a remembered water source could already have failed by the time people reached it. Individuals could die from dehydration, malnutrition, disease, or the cascading consequences of physical weakness. Entire local populations could disappear. Archaeologists and paleoanthropologists sometimes identify periods when human occupation becomes sparse or vanishes from particular regions as environmental conditions deteriorate. Interpreting those patterns requires caution because an absence of archaeological sites can have many explanations, including preservation and sampling. Still, human populations clearly expanded and contracted across landscapes over prehistoric time. Climate was one factor among many shaping those changes. Small populations were particularly vulnerable because the loss of even a limited number of people could affect the group's ability to hunt, gather, care for children, transmit knowledge, and maintain social connections. This reminds us that survival did not necessarily mean everyone survived. Human evolution was shaped by populations that endured, moved, mixed, and reproduced, but behind that long-term success were countless individuals and communities whose stories disappeared completely. Drought could also create consequences that continued after rain returned. A population reduced during years of scarcity might take generations to recover. Social networks could be disrupted, territories abandoned, and knowledge tied to particular landscapes could be lost or transformed as people moved elsewhere. At the same time, environmental instability created powerful selection pressures for flexibility. Humans who could exploit diverse foods, communicate information, maintain social relationships, and adjust movement patterns had tools for dealing with uncertainty that did not depend on controlling the weather. We couldn't make it rain, but we could change what we did when it didn't. That difference is central to understanding prehistoric drought survival. Our ancestors did not conquer dry landscapes through one miraculous technique. There was no secret Stone Age method for producing unlimited water. They survived, when they could, by combining many smaller advantages: observation, memory, mobility, dietary flexibility, social cooperation, and the willingness to leave familiar places when those places could no longer keep them alive. Together, those abilities transformed drought from an automatic death sentence into a problem that humans could sometimes escape. And that brings us back to the shrinking pool where our story began. Imagine that pool again. The water is lower than it was yesterday. The surrounding grass has turned dry, and animal tracks cover the muddy edge. This time, however, you understand what the people standing beside it actually possess. They have no weather forecast, but they can recognize unusual seasonal changes. They have no printed map, but experienced members of the group may remember rivers, springs, and roots spread across a large territory. They have no truck carrying emergency water, but they can move their camp before the local source completely disappears. They can watch animals, inspect vegetation, and read familiar terrain for clues. They can adjust where they hunt and gather, share information with others, and potentially rely on social relationships that extend beyond the immediate group, if necessary. They can leave. None of these strategies guarantees survival. A drought can become too severe, too widespread, or too long. Resources can fail faster than people can adapt, and prehistoric populations sometimes paid the ultimate price. But humans were not passive victims waiting beside an empty river. They were mobile, social animals with extraordinary capacities for memory, communication, and behavioral flexibility. Those capacities mattered because drought is fundamentally a problem of change. The place that supported you last year may not support you this year. The animal route you knew may shift. The plants you depended upon may fail. And the water source your grandparents remembered may disappear. Survival requires updating the mental map. That ability remains familiar today. Modern drought responses use technologies prehistoric humans could never have imagined. But the underlying questions are remarkably old. Where is reliable water? How much remains? Who needs it? How far can it be moved? And what happens if the shortage continues? The scale has changed. The problem has not. For ancient humans, There was one final advantage that modern life can make easy to overlook. They paid attention because they had to. A changing landscape wasn't background scenery. It was information about tomorrow's food, tomorrow's water, and tomorrow's survival. A river becoming shallower mattered. An animal herd changing direction mattered. Rain arriving late mattered. Reading those signals early could provide something more valuable than strength. Time? Time to search. Time to move. Time to contact others. Time to reach a place where water still flowed. So, how did ancient humans survive droughts? Not with one trick. And certainly not every time. They survived by knowing their landscapes, remembering where resources persisted, adjusting what they ate, maintaining social connections, and moving when staying became too dangerous. Sometimes they reached rivers, lakes, coasts, springs, or other refuges and waited for conditions to improve. Sometimes populations shifted across much larger regions as climate changed over generations. And sometimes, despite everything they knew, the drought won. That uncertainty is part of the real story of prehistoric survival. Humanity did not reach the present because our ancestors were invincible. We reached it because enough populations across enough changing landscapes repeatedly found another option before the last one disappeared. Eventually, the rain returned somewhere, plants grew again, animals moved back into recovering landscapes, and humans followed opportunities as they always had. The next time you turn on a tap and clean water appears instantly, remember how recent that certainty is in the history of our species. For most of human existence, water was never guaranteed simply because you needed it. You had to know where to find it, and sometimes you had to know when it was time to leave. If you enjoyed exploring how prehistoric humans survived a changing planet, take a moment to subscribe to Sketching Humanity. Let us know in the comments which ancient survival problem we should investigate next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next journey into humanity's prehistoric past.